For 20 plus years, she's taught students about death and dying at Maria, SUNY Canton, and for funeral directors all across New York State. In addition to discussing What a Wonderful World, her 2023 book, Clinton will provide suggestions for healing that can help anyone find their own pathway to coping with personal loss. And Eileen's personal story is moving and very beautiful. And I would also like to add that this event also has been generously sponsored by John Cannon Funeral Home. So without any more from me, Eileen will speak, and then we'll have some time afterwards for questions and answers. Thank you so much all for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Oh, wow, I have to say, this is like a deja vu moment. I think back in the 1970s when I was a student here. And of course, I'm giving away my age by just saying that I was here in the 1970s. I'd like to say I was just a toddler, but unfortunately, you know what? I just turned 70, and I'm proud to be 70. I'm proud to own my age. I'm proud to be alive, and I'm proud to share everything that I've learned from my life experiences. So it is a little bit awesome being here where I sat in lectures and listened to my professors, and I never dreamt that I would be a speaker here, especially at 70. You know, I didn't know what I expected at 70. But I want to thank Hudson Valley, everyone, for asking me to be here, and it really is an honor. And it just brings me back to being a student in the mortuary science program. And I'd like to ask at this point, how many students do we have here in general from the college? If you'd like to just show of hands. Okay, great. And how many are in the mortuary science program here? Yay! Congratulations. I hope that I can give you a little bit of information, like I can everyone here, about my journey. And as I say in the book, on the very first page, everyone has a story to tell, a story of love and a story of loss. And unfortunately, we can't avoid the loss part. If we love anyone, anything, and that is taken away from us, then unfortunately, grief is the response to that, the natural response. So I'd like to start off by telling a little bit about me, because I think it's important. Amy gave a brief introduction, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more so you know who I am as far as a speaker and what makes me, I want to say, an expert in the field of loss. What I've done over the years and in this book is to intertwine my professional experience as a funeral director, as a hospice bereavement coordinator, as a death educator, all of those areas with my personal experiences of loss. And that's what I want to share, maybe a little 5 minutes to tell you about that. And that also goes into the question, a lot of people will ask me, the first question is, why did you write this book? Why did you write this book at 70 years old? What inspired you? And so my story will explain how that came about. So I grew up in a family funeral home. My dad was a funeral director. My mom worked by his side. And I was around death all the time, but I never thought I wanted to be a funeral director. Back then in the 70s, as a woman, it was typically a nurse, a elementary school teacher, and that I thought I could never do, and something in business, secretarial, administrative. So I chose nursing. I thought that would be a good area for me to pursue. But then about a month before, I had this revelation that I didn't want to take care of sick people. I was like, oh no, I don't want to take care of sick people. And so I told my mom that I'm not going to go to nursing school. And she wasn't too happy. You know, even back then, it was the pressure to go to college. And so she goes, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. How many people at 18 know what they're going to do, even these days? I don't know if it was more difficult back then or now. There's so many choices. So anyway, my mom said, well, you have to do something. Well, I took a part-time job at McDonald's. That lasted about 3 weeks. That made me think, I need to go to school because I don't want to be working at McDonald's for the rest of my life. So I ended up taking a couple of courses here at Hudson Valley, and I found the mortuary science program in the catalog, and I said, wow, that sounds interesting. And back then, there weren't a lot of women, which I'm excited to see so many women here today, yay. But there weren't a lot of women. So when I went to my mom and dad and said, hey, I think I'm going to become a funeral director, they looked at me with a little bit of, awe, like, really? It was more of a business for the sons in the family. Needless to say, I went to Mortuary Science School, became a funeral director, and I owe a lot to Hudson Valley for giving me my start. You inspired me as a college, my professors, to continue on with my education, and that I did, going on to get my bachelor's and my master's. But as a funeral director, there was that moment in the cemetery when you're leaving these families that are grieving, and they are so heartbroken. I felt like I wanted to do more for them. So what could I do? I decided to go volunteer for hospice so I could be more involved with helping the bereaved families after the death, not only a week or so after, but 6 months, a year after. And so then I was working as a volunteer, and I was asked to take a position working there as a hired employee. And so needless to say, the story goes on that I became the bereavement coordinator at St. Peter's Hospice. And there I learned so much. And you can learn so much from the books, from your classroom, but it's the actual clinical experience of working with families. They are, I believe, our teachers. When we want to learn about grief and loss, you talk to a bereaved individual and ask them about their loss or experience. And that is how we truly learn and how we can then support those families. And during that time period, my husband was diagnosed with lung cancer. And he died 8 months after. I was 49 years old, and I was a widow. And where was I going to go now? My journey continues and goes where? I didn't know. But a good friend of mine, Sister Jean Roach, was the chaplain at St. Peter's Hospice, and we worked together. And she said to me, Eileen, Marie College wants to start a bereavement educational program. I said, wonderful. We need to educate people more. Not only funeral directors, but the nurses, the teachers, veterinarians, lawyers. We had all kinds of students that came to our program to be educated on grief and loss. And it was wonderful. It was inspiring for me. So for 20 years, we had this wonderful program, and life was good. I started teaching at SUNY Canton, the funeral directors, virtual, online, and that was wonderful. But then, if we recall that famous time period of 2020, all right, 2020, when COVID happened, well, for me, it was even more alarming, because right before COVID happened, February 14th, I was diagnosed with leukemia. And it was one of those shocks that I was perfectly fine. It had to be a mistake, denial at its greatest. How could I possibly have leukemia? But I did. And so then my journey took another detour. And where was I going now? I was at Memorial Sloan Hospital for 5 weeks, and then COVID breaks out, and then the whole world turned upside down. And I was told I needed a stem cell transplant. And unfortunately, my chances of survival, my doctor told me, was 30%. When I asked him, I said, so I didn't know much about leukemia. And I said, so what are my chances of survival? And he said, 30%. And I said, is that all? And he goes, well, maybe 35. I'm like, oh, great, thanks. 35%, it didn't sound like great odds. But anyway, I went to Dana-Farber for my stem cell transplant. And interestingly, I had my stem cell transplant on June 18th, which was my father's birthday. And I saw that as a sign. I'm a person of faith, but I want to say unconventional. And I do believe in divine providence, that I'm meant to be here today. I'm meant to have written this book. And things just happen for a reason. I do believe that in my soul. And so in between my hospitalization at Memorial Sloan and Dana-Farber, considering my chances and considering my background as a funeral director, I needed to make sure that all of my ducks were in a row. If I should die during that time period, I wanted everything to be in order for my children to take over. So there was the legal, there was the financial, making sure everything was right, my obituary. And I talk about this in the book and how it was difficult, but I wanted it taken care of. So I was also going through my computer, and on my computer, I found these poems that I had written when my husband was dying. And I started writing those poems because I didn't know what to do with my feelings. My husband is dying. How do I feel? How do I deal with this? And then he died eight and a half months after, and I'm a widow. I write one poem, The Widow, what the name itself meant for me. Being a widow at 49, it was overwhelming. But needless to say, I went through these poems, and I had a thought. I said, I'm going to put all these poems together in one document, copy and paste, put them in a document so that my children could have them. But then when I did that, I realized that each poem needed a backstory so that my children would know what I was going through at the time. And the poems are unique because they're written in chronological order, from before my husband's death, when he was dying, up until about 2 years after. And that's when I basically stopped writing. And I call them poetry, sappy poetry. If you're in an English class, I'm sure that these poems don't fit into any category. But for me, the key lesson here is that was my coping strategy, to write about my feelings. And it was difficult because as a funeral director, as a grief expert, people would look at me and say, well, it must be easier for you because you've been around grief all your life. You know how to do it. Well, when you're on the other side of the fence, it doesn't matter what your background is. Our hearts are broken. We just question all of those things. So what I'd like to do, so that's the backstory about how I wrote this book. I ended up writing these poems, putting the poems together, and then after I did the backstory, I realized, wow, this is the beginning of a book. I didn't plan on writing this. Once again, divine providence, it just came to me. So I said, I need an introduction, I need a conclusion, and then I'll put in my professional expertise about giving people suggestions on how to cope with loss. And so at this point, I'd like to read a couple of poems so that you can get an idea about how the bereaved individual can relate to my personal experience and take away that part of my personal experience. So this is a poem that seems to relate to most people, especially people that have had a recent loss. And when I say recent loss, I've given these programs all year long. And a lot of times people will come up to me afterwards and they start sharing their story about their loved one who died a week ago. And then I have someone else who comes up and talks about their loved one died 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And the loss is still there. And I'll speak more about that in a minute after I read this poem. But this one here is called Don't Tell Me. Don't tell me you know how I feel. You can't possibly know my pain. Don't dare tell me how to grieve. Crying myself to sleep, I will choose how to grieve. Crying myself to sleep, screaming in the shower, or writing sappy poetry. Don't tell me what I should do. How do you know what is best for me? Don't tell me it was God's will. It was not my will. Don't tell me about your grief. This is not about you. Don't tell me time will heal. I fear I never will heal. Don't tell me it will be okay. How can it ever be okay? Don't sit and judge me. Just listen. Don't talk at me. Just listen, just listen. Don't try to fix me. Only I can fix me. Don't let me scare you away. I need you to walk with me, one step at a time, by my side. Don't say anything, just walk with me and listen. And that is a poem that really seems to touch people because after we have a loss, people are always saying these things to us. Don't worry, things will be okay. It will get better with time. Well, if you've been bereaved yourself or if you're talking with people, we understand that grief is not linear. Grief does not get better with every week or every month that goes by. I like to describe grief as a roller coaster with its ups and downs. And as a funeral director, we know that right after the death and during the services, we usually have lots of support. Friends come and family are there to support us. But then as the weeks go by, those friends kind of go away and we go back to work after a few days of bereavement leave. Our employers expect us to be back to normal. Our colleagues expect us to be back to normal. Because after all, it's been 4 months since your loved one died, whether it be your mother, your father, your husband, your child, but you're expected to get back in the swing of things. And it doesn't work that way. So what happens is around 4 to 6 months, we actually end up feeling worse. Can you understand that? Because all the support systems are gone away. People actually forget. They know in the back of the mind, in their mind, that your loved one died, but they don't consciously think about it. So therefore, those support systems that we had in the beginning seem to be lacking as time goes by. When I worked at hospice, most of the calls that I would receive from family members for a support group, for help, thinking that they're going crazy. That was the normal feeling. I must be going crazy because it's been 6 months since my husband died. But that is very normal. And what we can do is to help normalize that and help provide support at that 6 month to a year and longer. There's no time period. While grief is a universal experience, everyone experiences grief on their own terms, on their own way. There's no equation for you have to do this, this, and that. And when I was here at Hudson Valley, in one of my courses, I remember learning about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which was my role model. She was wonderful and really broke the doors open to discussions on death and dying. And she wrote the book on death and dying back in 1969. And her 5 stages of dying is known by grammar school students. Everyone knows it. And you have to realize that she wrote her book in 1969, number one. Number two, her book was really designed for the dying patient, told the story of what dying patients experience, not necessarily for the bereaved. So completely different. But now I like to encourage people, although I loved Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I loved her, opening up the door, but we got to forget about those stages. Those stages of death and dying are so outdated. We have so many other professionals, like experts in the field. I love Dr. William Warden, who is great, Therese Randall, Robert Niemeyer. These are some of the more current experts in the field. And they talk about reconstruction and the task of what we do after we experience the death of a loved one. So these are readings that I encourage people to look into. But on a really practical level, I want to say, forget about all the clinical experts and just get down to the basics, helping people to get in touch with their feelings. I always would start my support group with a simple, it was like a 10-minute exercise, and I'd go around to like the 15 people. I'd say, okay, concentrate on just how you're feeling right now. One word to describe the feeling that you have. And we'd go around the circle, and everyone would just identify whether it was sadness, anger, envy, jealousy, resentment, stress-free. But people would get in touch. And I often think about this one man, and he came to the group, which was too early, but someone allowed him to come to the group because it was only like a week after his wife died. And he was a young widower, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. And his wife died rather suddenly. And within that week, I think he read every book there was on grief and loss. And when I asked him to identify a feeling, he started quoting from all these books. And it's like, well, they tell me I should feel this. They tell me this and that and that. I said, no. Get out of your head, just for a few minutes. Get out of your head and get in touch with your heart. How do you feel? And that's, I consider, the first step in the grieving process, to be able to identify your feelings. And then the next step is, so what do I do with those feelings? I had a friend years ago whose young son died in a car accident, and he was so angry, understandably, that his son had died. And so in between the car accident and the night of the services, he took his hand and punched a brick wall as hard as he could. I don't have to tell you what happened afterwards as he came into the funeral home with his hand all bandaged up. So when we look at a situation like that, anger is a normal response, but what we want to try to do is encourage people to address that anger in a healthy way. I'll tell you a funny story. I always say, hopefully I can make people, I don't want to make people cry, but they often do, but also laughing. So my daughter was probably about 12 years old, 13. She was going through that adolescent period. And so she was so upset about something one day, and it was just she and I. And so I said, well, you know, Jen, what's really helpful is to just scream and let it out. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, go ahead and scream. You know, children, little toddlers go through temper tantrums, right? Because they have no idea of what's appropriate in society. So they have temper tantrums in the grocery store, wherever. We as parents are mortified. It's like, oh no. But anyway, so my daughter, she started. She goes, you know, she lets out a little scream. And I said, no, Jen, scream, scream. And she did it a little louder. And then a little louder. And I said, go ahead, Jen, scream more. And so finally she let it out. And I said, okay, that's good. That's a good way to release our anger, to release our feelings. But then about 3 weeks later, we're at the dinner table. And it's my husband and my son and myself and my daughter. And so anyway, something happened. And all of a sudden, my daughter lets out this belt scream at the dinner table. And my husband looks at me, and it's like, what is she doing? And I said, well, we had this little talk about screaming and that it's a good way to release your anger and your feelings. And my husband's just looking at me, and he goes, oh, no. So then I proceeded to educate my daughter and say, honey, there's a time and a place, you know? You can scream in the shower. Don't scream in the grocery store. They'll call 911 and have you put away, okay? So anyway, these are little things as far as teaching people how to cope with their feelings. And that's a lot of what I did in my support groups as far as helping people understand. And another lesson from the support group, which identifies how people that can experience the same loss will grieve in a completely different way. So I had this husband and wife that came to group, and lovely couple. And their adult son had completed suicide. And they came to the group, and they were grieving. And they were with the group for about a year. And the mom, you'd say, was a very typical, intuitive griever. She was sharing her feelings. She was crying and talking about her loss, and very appropriate. And of course, the dad, her husband, was sitting alongside of her. And he sat there, and I looked at him often, and he had his eyes closed. And he sat there for the whole length of the group. And every now and then I'd say, Jim, would you like to share something? And no, I'm fine, I'm fine. And even me, as a so-called grief expert, I'm thinking, well, why isn't he sharing more? You know, look at the wife, she's sharing so much. And I always say, don't judge, don't be judgmental. But I have to admit, I was questioning. Was I failing him because I couldn't get him to share more? So finally, I just let it be. And around a year, he comes up to me after group, and he hands me this large envelope that was quite full. And so I looked at him, questioning, and he said, Eileen, I'd like you to read these. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, well, these are letters that I've been writing to my son over the past year. Wow. So that was night and day. And that was, once again, another learning experience for me not to judge how people are grieving and how they share their feelings. He was doing it privately, writing, and that was his healing and that therapy. He was there to support his wife in the grief experience, but she was grieving in a completely different way. Both very appropriate, both very healthy. With that, I'd like to share another poem that a lot of people seem to relate to. And this poem I wrote a year after my husband died. And just to show the differences on what happens. And that's why I like the chronological order of these poems, because it follows my grief journey. This one is entitled Grief Changes. A year has passed, and my grief lingers. I appear fine, but hurt so inside. My heart aches, and I feel broken. Others have forgotten, but my pain runs deep. Time rolls on, but my life stands still. I struggle to find my way, but flounder hopelessly. Sometimes there's a light, but it dims quickly. I hold on to a spark and hope it ignites, for what else is there? I'm okay, so I say, but the words mean little. Friends marvel at my plight. They ask, how do you continue to fight? The time has come to start again. A new life, a new career, new friends, new hobbies. Life has changed, and I have changed. I have choices to make. To survive or to thrive. And ending on that note, to survive or to thrive, I often stress with our bereaved families that at a time after death, when our loved one leaves us, dies, we feel like we have no control over life. Everything is taken away from us. We have no control. But yet you do have control. You have choices that you can make. You have choices to reach out for help if you're really floundering. You can reach out for support groups, for educational programs, to your local pastor. There's so many different things that you can do, but the idea is to encourage people to take the step, to take action forward, to get the support that they need. And 90% of those who are bereaved will experience what we refer to as normal grief. Normal grief. But normal grief hurts like hell. You know, you experience the death of your mother, your husband, whoever that is, your grandmother, and it hurts. So, but it's still normal. We don't have to make it pathological. You don't necessarily need a psychiatrist or a therapist to help you through this. But you need good listeners. And that's why I like that concept. And, you know, if you're with someone who's hurting, don't worry about what you're saying. Say nothing. Just be there. Be present. Your presence is the gift that you can give that is most significant. And so the last couple chapters I write about a whole bunch of things that we can do during the grieving process, encouraging people. One thing that I love is a gratitude journal. A gratitude journal, to me, I like to focus on it. Like right now in life, our world is upside down, our country is upside down, and a lot of people feel lost. But what can we be grateful for in our everyday life? And my mother taught me a valuable lesson that I think about, I want to say almost every single day, every single night before I go to bed. She said, you know, we need to be grateful for a good bed to sleep in and a roof over our head. It's very simple. That's as simple as it gets, but not for a lot of people that don't have that. So to be grateful for that. And there was this one woman in my group, and she was probably in her early 40s, and her husband died, and she was left with 2 young children. And she came to group, and she was really searching for the help, the support that she desperately needed. And the topic that night was hope. What can we have hope for life after the death of a loved one? And everybody was sharing a little bit here and there. And then all of a sudden she stomped her foot and she said, I don't understand it. So everybody was very quiet. And she spoke and she said, "Hope for what?" She said, "My husband just died. I have 2 young children. What is there possibly to hope for?" And that was her expressing her hopelessness at the moment. And she couldn't conceive of life without her husband. What was she going to do? But she kept on coming to group, and I encouraged her. I said, "You know, Mary," I said, "before you go to bed at night, or maybe it's first thing in the morning, whatever works for you, try to take a few minutes and just write down one thing that you can be grateful for. In the midst of your hopelessness, try to find one thing and write that down. And every day, maybe you can grow that gratitude journal." She did so, and every now and then she said it was kind of helpful. But then again, maybe about 9 months or so afterwards, after coming to group, she shared with the group, and she said, "Several months back, I didn't understand the concept of hope, but now I get it. I do understand that there is hope for a future for myself and for my children." So trying to instill that hope and that gratitude journal, I think, can be really helpful. Even if you haven't had a recent loss, I really love the concept of a gratitude journal. But what I try to do is don't tell people what they should do. And this is my phrase that I coined years ago. It's like, don't be should on. All right? My editor thought I made a mistake in my book because I write that in the book. It's like, don't be should on. So he goes, "Eileen, I think you made a mistake on page so-and-so. Should on? I don't think that's, a real word." And I said, "Yes, it is." When people start telling you, you should go to church more often, you should join a support group, you should start dating again, people start telling you what you should do. I say, when you hear that word should, forget what they're saying. On the other hand, if you want to help people, it's not that we can't give suggestions. We can go ahead and say, change it to the first person. Instead of saying, "You should do this," you can say, "I found that going to a support group was very helpful for me. I found that going to a new church instead of the old church was better for me." So you can give people ideas, but talking from the first person instead of, it's like, "You should do this." And they point their finger too. Don't you love that? When they point their finger and say, "You really should be doing this." So many lessons. And as I said, the last 2 chapters, and I'll just run through these really quick because we obviously don't have time to talk about them. This could be a whole class. But anyway, some ideas besides keeping a journal is, okay, where's my pages here? Oh, I just have to say. So we did a little photo shoot earlier, and I found a photograph of me graduating from Hudson Valley. I love it. All right, so I had lots of hair back then, and it was brown. It was a completely different color, and I guess I look quite a bit younger. But speaking of that, that's my next story that I have to share. My family is so tired of listening to me share this story, but it's like one of my faves. So anyway, this was in the area for suggestions about humor. Humor is really healthy. Laughing is healthy. And I don't know if many of you know, but Sister Ann Bryan Smolin was a psychiatrist that was in the Albany area, and she was wonderful. She wrote several books on the power of humor and laughter. One of her books is Tickle Your Soul. I highly recommend it if anyone's looking for some good reads on laughter. But anyway, I write about this in the book, and then I talk about, and on a personal note. So after I had my stem cell transplant and another round of chemotherapy, I had lost all my hair, and I was completely bald. And it was in the height of COVID, and we spent a lot of time outside when we were close to my daughter's house in the Boston area. And so we'd be outside, and I always had hats on, big sun hats, because naturally I had to protect my head, and naturally I was trying to conceal my bald head. So anyway, My little granddaughters were 3 and 5 at the time. By the way, it's been 4.5 years since my stem cell transplant, and that's why I celebrate life, okay? Every day I'm alive. That's my gratitude. I'm so grateful for everything in my life right now. But anyway, the little 3-year-old, she's sitting across from me on the picnic bench, and she said, "Nana, why do you always wear a hat?" So I looked at her and I said, "Well, honey," I said, "you know, Nana was really sick and I was in the hospital. And at that point, the doctors gave me medicine, and that medicine made me feel better. And the bad side was I lost all my hair, but it will grow back." So anyway, she looked at me with curious eyes. And I said, "Would you like Nana to take her hat off?" And she shook her head in excitement. So I took my hat off, I turned around, and she's looking at my bald head. And now I look back and I meet her eyes, and she's got fear in her eyes. And I said, "So honey, what do you think?" And she goes, "Nana, I think you should put your hat back on." Like now. So anyway, that was for me. But I think we need to wind up, and we have a few minutes if people would like to ask questions. I will be signing books afterwards. If anybody wants to buy a book, I'm happy to sign them and sell you a book. But anyway, any questions that we have? Nothing? Or we do have someone?
We have one over here.
Okay, great.
Is this too loud? Okay. When my grandma died in the hospital, I didn't cry at all, and for weeks, months, it's been a little over a year since my grandma died, and I kept thinking, is there something wrong with me because I haven't cried? Like, it is like, I cry over the most trivial reasons sometimes, but I don't cry often, and I always felt sort of bad that I didn't cry because my grandma died. It was mostly internal. So what do you think about that?
What do you think? Let me throw it back to you real quick. What do you think first? Do you think it was not normal for you?
I think I was worried I had some kind of sociopathic tendencies. I thought, is there something wrong with me because I didn't cry when my grandma died?
Okay. So first of all, we have to recognize that it goes back to that universal, grief is universal, but everyone grieves in a different way. I can cry at the drop of a hat. My husband's favorite song was "What a Wonderful World," which is the name of the book. And I hear that song, and it's been 20 years since my husband died, but I can still cry. And other people, they don't cry. And it just speaks to the fact that we all grieve in a different way. And there's no rule that says you have to cry. There's no rule that says you have to go to the cemetery. A lot of people like to visit the cemetery. So there's a lot of myths out there about what we should do after the death of a loved one. Same way at the cemetery, the same way in the support group. When the gentleman that was there whose son died, he didn't cry, but his wife did. There was nothing wrong with him. So there's nothing wrong if you don't cry.
Any other questions?
I don't need the mic, it's fine. I'm a sociologist on campus, and I think, in our culture, we're kind of separate from death, really, right?
Yes.
We don't teach it. We don't teach how to handle even stressful situations, let alone some amazing, profound stressor like the loss of someone, or even the loss of a relationship, right? Even grieving the living, so to speak, is still a grief. And I think this is a great way to bring some of that. I think in mortuary science, right? It's like we
Thank you for the lovely comments, and I totally agree with you. And that's one reason I believe in divine providence, that I'm here today to be able to open up the door and encourage people. I'm hoping that my book will help people to share their stories. And that's why we created an educational program at Maria College, to have more people take courses and open the door to talking about grief and loss. So yes, I 100% agree. Whenever we can take that opportunity to talk about it is critical. I know we're running out of time. Yes.
So in the first poem, you mentioned that you didn't want to hear about other people's grief and their experiences. But in the later half of your speech, where you mentioned like you didn't want to hear shoulds, and in order to engage with people, you would say like, I found that this was helpful or this. But how would you go and engage with someone in that sort of manner in a way that was respectful to their feelings?
What was the last part? How would I?
How would you go about engaging with those people in that kind of manner in a way that is respectful of their feelings?
I'm still not catching the last part. I think your voice is like fading out a little bit. Sorry.
Like, just like, how would you say that I found this helpful or this in a way that's respectful to their feelings, so that they don't feel like you're pushing your grief onto them?
Okay. Yes. So, I mean, personally, when I'm working with individuals, I tend not to share, okay, my grief. Now it's in a book and it's all out there. So one thing that people really hate to hear is, I know exactly how you feel. And we have a tendency to say that as far as you've had the loss of your mom and you're going to someone else's funeral service and you say, I know exactly how you feel because my mom died. Well, we don't know exactly how people feel because every loss is so different. And so number one, we have to avoid saying, this is, start talking about your own grief. But on the other hand, I always say, tell me what you think would work for you. And I don't have time to share this other story, maybe a little bit. Okay, so I had this woman in my support group. She was like 80 years old, and her husband died, and she didn't know what to do. She had been caregiving for him for a year. And so, we had talked about different ideas on coping, and none of them really rang true for her. But I don't have all the ideas that will work for everyone. So I asked, so what do you think would help you? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, what did you do before your husband got sick, before you were his caregiver? And she goes, well, I used to go to the gym every single week, and I used to swim. Now, I would never suggest swimming because I'm not a swimmer, I just wouldn't. But for her, that was part of her coping mechanism on an everyday basis. So I suggested to her, I said, well, if you swam before your husband got sick, maybe you can consider going to the gym again. And she said, I might do that. And it worked for her. So I helped her figure out what would work for her. Does that make sense? So we can eliminate talking about, like my personal grief experience. If people ask me prior to my writing the book, well, Eileen, what was it like when your father died? And I said, well, I'd rather talk about the death of your father right now. Tell me what you're feeling. So I always try to switch the topic back to getting them to talk. So then from what they say, I can maybe give them back, mirror their thoughts. Is that helpful?
We do still have a few more minutes, so are there any other questions?
I was trying to be so quick on that, so.
Hello, my name is Shawnee. I'm new to the funeral service, but I'm a mortuary student and I'm very interested. The one thing I find myself to be very logical in the sense of death, so that's why I kind of shifted into this program. And my father passed away and I didn't cry as well. I was someone who was able to kind of navigate it and help out. But there are times where I do find myself, like even when you were talking in the first poem you read, I kind of like had a tear or two drop. Are there times, especially with you dealing with bereavement, where you may feel too connected or emotionally drawn, and like you might show your emotions, because like I don't ever want to deal with the client and then you feel their trauma and you kind of cry or something and kind of draw the attention onto you. How would you dial back, or has there ever been a time where like something reminded you of a wife with their husband and it kind of like distraught you and you're like, need a pick me up to kind of be the ear or person for the actual bereaved?
Great question, and I have an example that I can give to maybe give some clarification. So I had this woman who was in a SID support group for her baby had died of sudden infant death syndrome. And so I had suggested that she go see a counselor. And she goes, Eileen, I already tried that. And she goes, I went to the counselor, and she sat there, and she sat with her arms crossed, and I'm pouring out my heart about finding my baby dead in the crib. And she's sitting there with no expression, no emotion whatsoever. And I felt completely invalidated. And so she shared that story with me. And it's a lesson that we can't go from showing no feelings to, on the other extreme, there was a woman that was in the mortuary science program when I was here. And she told the story about being in the funeral home. And every time they took the casket out of the funeral home, she started sobbing, crying, okay? So we have two extremes. Now, as a funeral director, the families are depending upon us to lead, okay, to lead us through. So we have to balance our feelings as a doctor or a nurse. Do you want a nurse giving you an IV that's like, I don't think I can do this. This hurts. So we have to balance that idea of controlling our own emotions, being sensitive, but it's also processing our loss. Like I know I had several individuals that I saw for counseling after my husband died, and I had to let go of it because I couldn't sit there and listen to somebody else's grief when I was so full of my own grief. And then I got a call from hospice, and they asked me if I'd like to come back to work, 2 weeks after. And I said, no, I can't. So I made a career choice. I changed, and I did something completely different. So, I think the key is learning to balance our feelings, processing our feelings. I do programs for funeral directors and healthcare professionals in balancing our own losses. And that's something that we need to talk about, something that we need to look at, what it is for a funeral director when we have our personal losses. Thank you.
So thank you all for attending today's lecture with Eileen Clinton on behalf of Voices and on behalf of the Hudson Valley Community College Alumni Association. We were really glad that you all were here today. Eileen will be outside. She does have her books. It's a beautiful book, and I really recommend that you pick up a copy, and Eileen will sign it for you, too. So thanks again for coming. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.